Hello, everyone. My name's Troy Skinner. Thanks for coming today. I work at Immersyve, where we created self-determination theory, which is the leading science framework worldwide for understanding motivation and behavior. Our founding group, which you can tell by these numbers, is very old, has over 350 published papers and 100 plus years of combined experience in applied work. Our model is used or referenced more than 30,000 times per year. Other academics use it. There's research across tons of domains, so if you ever need some bedtime reading, there's lots of information to find on the net after this talk. And then where I focus is on a unique practice at the intersection of software and motivation, consulting on 50 plus app projects a year. Essentially what we go in is talk to developers, talk about design, figure out ways to increase engagement by using good behavioral science practices. Attention that you see a lot of times in design conversations is between business objectives. You're trying to focus on bringing down churn, raising subscriptions, very laudable goals that are important to our businesses, and being customer first, which obviously is an aspiration if you care about who uses your applications. This is a very natural tension, but we found in our work that it doesn't have to be. The exciting news coming out of our decades of research is that when you really focus on satisfying consumers' fundamental basic psychological needs, it increases their value for the application. And that increased value shows up in all the outcome metrics that are important to our businesses. You see reduced churn, you see greater engagement, you see greater monetization. Kind of where we fit in the picture is obviously we've gotten very good as an industry at building applications. Lots of them are in the world. We've gotten very good at collecting behavioral data, so we know if there's good outcomes in our apps or bad outcomes in our apps. But where there's kind of a black box is in the middle about why people do what they do. So what we do at Immersyve is we really focus on understanding why people do the things they do within applications. Not only understanding it, but measuring it with really concrete, discrete, granular metrics, and then helping use that information to make better design decisions about how to improve apps. Self-determination theory is, again, focused on fundamental human psychology. So kind of the underpinnings of that is that every human, all of us, everyone in this room, has three basic fundamental psychological needs, which I'll get into in more detail later. But we also look at things like intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, goals and motives, which are essential to long-term engagement, mindfulness, vitality. It's a robust, comprehensive model of motivation, so it has a lot of different nooks and crannies, not all of which we'll get into today. Also, because it's about fundamental human motivation, it travels to a lot of different contexts. I do a lot of work in entertainment software. We work with world-class athletic programs to avoid athlete burnout. We work in education. We work in retirement. Because it's about humans, it's not trapped in any domain, so it works across all applications, because if humans use it, then motivation applies. So now let's actually get to the topic at hand. Something that you see a lot when people talk about motivation is that more is better, that we want to essentially get people to act by jamming them full of motivation. You can kind of see in this humorous picture that if you have an exercise app and your plan is to have everyone chased by a T-Rex, you'd certainly get lots of running, but that probably wouldn't lead to long-term engagement once the terror subsided. The right way to think about motivation is not that you want more, it's about what the quality of the motivation is. So quality of motivation is more important than quantity of motivation, which kind of brings us to a continuum that I'll lay out here for you guys. Essentially, if you look at, we can measure these things. If you look at what people are experiencing in your app, there's basically low motivation that ranges from they don't care, through feeling external pressure to engage in the app, internal pressure, which means I feel like I should do it, I feel guilt or shame to do it, or personal value, which means I have a good reason, a strong rationale for engaging in the app, to intrinsic value, which is like, I just love running or I just love using this app. These are all different categories of motivation, and they lead to very different outcomes. On the kind of bottom, you see that low quality motivation leads to less engagement, lower productivity, less learning, everything that we care about. And in contrast, high motivation leads to great outcomes. So why is this useful? Well, what we do is we measure individual users, the quality of their motivation, and it allows us to basically customize our content to meet consumers where they are motivationally. So if someone has low quality motivation, they don't really have a good rationale for using your app, then some of your strategies might be to essentially communicate to them where they might find more personal value in the application. If in contrast, someone's already in love with the application, you don't need to convince them to use it. Instead, you continue to empower what's driving that intrinsic value, showing them increased opportunities, essentially, and also avoiding undermining that motivation by being very mechanistic with your design. And I'll kind of explain what that means more. So, now let's get into the theory. There are 3 basic psychological needs. Needs is the important word here. They're not wants, in the same way that hunger is a physiological need. So someone in the room might say, sorry, Troy, I don't believe in hunger. I'm not a hunger guy. Doesn't matter if you believe in it or not. If you don't eat, you'll starve to death. Same thing with psychological needs. If these aren't fulfilled, then you essentially starve psychologically. It works across cultures, across genders, across ages. It fundamentally works for everyone in the same way that hunger does. So what are these needs? The first one's autonomy. This is our need to feel like we're the author of our life, of our experience. We're the one driving the action. The opposite of autonomy is feeling controlled or manipulated by someone or an application. What you want to think about during development when trying to design for increased autonomy is first, focus on features that help users build a personal narrative of value for your application. Essentially, the way to think about it is you're always trying to get people to form long-term goals, not take actions based upon very short-term motivations. The underpinning of long-term goal formation is, why am I doing this? What's my rationale? How will this help me? How will this aid me? So that communication has to be enormously clear. The opposite of that is essentially a carrots and sticks approach, which is something you want to avoid. This is things like rewards, badges, time pressure, those kinds of things that get people to take actions. It's not that rewards can't be an important part of motivation, but they have to be subordinate to people having a personal narrative. If there's something they want to accomplish and they take meaningful steps towards that and you reward them, that's awesome. If they don't have that personal narrative and essentially you're trying to generate actions all through carrots and sticks, that's going to lead to short-term improvement in behavior, but mid-term and long-term problems. And so it's important which foundation you're building on. The last thing is when possible, you want to provide meaningful choices about how to interact with the app, like what value they get out of things, because essentially if people get choices, then obviously it's easier for them to endorse the path they're on because they're helping to design what their experience is. The second need is our need for relatedness. This is our need to meaningfully connect with other people, to feel like they matter to us, we matter to them. Things to think about during development. There's lots of mistakes that happen in kind of social realm around relatedness, is that it's kind of like the more is not better. It's not about how many connections you have on LinkedIn. It's about the quality of the relationships that you have with people within the application. So what you want to catalyze is meaningful support. Where you see real improvement in metrics and behavior is when people feel like they matter to one another. So it's how do you build those relationships, allow people to meaningfully support one another, do things like collaborate together on a shared project, have shared goals, coordinate. Mentorship relationships are a big deal. If someone's expert in a topic, can they help someone that's less expert? That's meaningful to both parties. Those are the kinds of relationships you're trying to bring about. Another thing that's very common in app development is you see that people will take an action in the app and it'll get shared out to their social network. It's not always the best policy. Once we worked on a exercise and weight loss app that had the brilliant idea that every time you gained weight to tell everyone you've ever met that you just ate a lot of food in Berlin. Not really the best communication for your social identity. So it's like there's kind of this automatic assumption that any sharing is good, but you always have to think about it from the sharer's perspective. Everything you say is not necessarily something they want out there. Which brings us to the last thing. What people are fundamentally trying to do in most applications is create a social identity that basically celebrates what they're good at, what makes them different, like essentially what's distinct about them. Those are the messages they want delivered. I don't want people to know that I gained 5 pounds. I want people to know that I got to give a talk at Google Play. These are exciting things. So you really want to identify what narrative people are trying to write that has social impact and kind of communicate that for them. The last need, which is often the easiest to understand, is our need for competence. This is our desire to be effective, to be masterful, to grow. Tends to be very intuitive to everyone that works in development because obviously if your app is not accessible, if people can't use it, then obviously they fail at high rates. So during development, one of the things that we see people have the most trouble with is when giving feedback to users. as it's important to be informational rather than judgmental. So let's say that I'm picking up an exercise app and I instantly don't know how to do a push-up, which is likely. Then if you essentially flash a big red light and say you have failed at push-up, that makes me feel incompetent and not really want to stick with the exercise. In contrast, if I get informational feedback about how to do it better, then I grow, then you're on the right side of motivation. So a lot of times we do things accidentally. We're trying to be clear and telling people what's happening in the application, but accidentally we essentially judge their lack of effectiveness, and that basically undermines motivation. So if it's informative and they grow, good news. If it's judgmental, it's bad news. The next thing is that you want to provide scaffolding for successful growth throughout the lifetime of your application. So what we're going to talk about more is that when you have a huge consumer base, people come in with different degrees of expertise, and then as they engage in your app, obviously they're building experience over time and becoming more and more competent. So if you know that fundamentally people need to grow or they're going to quit an experience, then you have to realize that you need to meet each person where they are, both from an expertise standpoint and from an experience standpoint, at the point that they really need information. So you have to be really contextual about understanding what's important to people progressing and kind of giving that information when they need it. The last thing is because growth is so instrumental to people having investment in an application, part of your communication strategy, the way in which you want to talk about your app, both in-app and kind of when just talking to people, is you want to kind of foreshadow for them paths for growth and how they can continue to develop the longer they stay with the app. That's essentially where people get a lot of value from things, so that's essentially a key part of your messaging and communication. So fulfillment of these needs is essential in applications because they're essential in life. This is not a model that's talking about app development. It's a model that's talking about what leads to fulfilling, enriched, satisfied consumers. So when your application leverages these truths about motivation, then you get lots of benefits to all the things that you care about as a business, long-term engagement, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the general framework. A lot of times it's easier to understand this when we go from the general conversation to specifics. So I'm going to talk about some of the apps that we've worked with recently and kind of put a little more meat on these bones. So an important topic that's a huge issue for behavioral scientists is retirement. I don't know, it's basically everyone understands how important it is to lifelong happiness to prepare for retirement, but in the States, only 4 out of 10 people actually are saving enough money, so 60% of the population is not prepared. It's a huge behavioral science problem because it's something that you have to do for the benefit of people and for the country, but no one really wants to engage in it. Why don't they want to engage in it? Well, the first thing is that unlike games and entertainment apps, saving money is not inherently fun. Very few people on a Friday night, when they're reviewing all the options of enjoyable things they can do, think now's the time for retirement planning. So when you work as a behavioral scientist on this problem, the first thing is that anyone you talk to doesn't want to talk about the topic, which obviously is a challenge. When we started looking at retirement apps, we ran into another problem. All retirement apps start with what we would basically characterize as terrifying math questions. So they basically ask you these two things. They first say, when do you plan to retire? And the second thing they say is, how long will you stay in retirement? When you look at that closely, what it really basically boils down to is, when are you planning to die? So if you wanted to demotivate people, that's essentially the perfect construction, because not only do people not know the answer to those questions, but it makes them feel an existential crisis that they don't know the answer and that death is impending. So retirement apps, if their goal has been to terrify their customers, they're really on top of things. And horribly, that is their goal, because essentially their model for how to increase retirement is to scare people, to essentially make them feel that if they don't do this, then horrible things will happen to them. If you remember what we talked about earlier about motivational quality, that's what we call external pressure, where you're basically trying to get actions by scaring people. Instead, what we want to do is make people realize what the benefit for them of preparing for retirement is. So we had a different view than the traditional retirement industry. So how did we approach this? First, we wanted to flip the script and basically talk to the people using the app and say, it's not about math, it's about creating a foundation for living the life that you love. one of the big disconnects that people have when they think about retirement is they don't realize that the person they're going to be in 10, 20, 30 years when they retire is the same person they are now. So where we wanted to start the conversation is basically, what do you love in life? If you had more time, more money, how would you spend that time and money? What are your passions? What do you care about? This is diametrically opposed to when do you plan to die. It's essentially saying, why do you want to live? What do you care about? So that's where we started the application script. The second thing is, once we got people really fixed on that point, we wanted to make them more effective at answering the questions we needed them to answer to figure out what the right plan was for them. So we made the language less jargony, made it more colloquial, tied the questions back to the plan that they had already started to make when they discussed what they cared about their lives, and it put things in a much more comfortable way for them to kind of intelligently answer those questions. One of the things that you find when you take this approach is that people feel much more support and caring from the application and the company, because it's not trying to terrify them anymore. It's basically trying to support them and help them plan for retirement, so relatedness scores shot up immediately. When we worked with our client, they came to us, so they obviously felt some appeal for this approach. But then when we started to say, this is what our plan is, they were kind of nervous, because their experience over dozens of years of working in this field was the longer you made the application process, the more people that quit along the way. And essentially asking people what they wanted to do with their lives lengthened the process. And so even though they believed in it, they were nervous about its success. Happily, what we saw when we finished the application is that retirement savings were increased by more than 400% versus the previous design. And as I mentioned previously, customer loyalty and appreciation soared because now people felt supported in the process of figuring out retirement rather than scared. Another area that we've worked in a lot is health and fitness. Health and fitness, also very challenging, maybe not as hard as retirement, which is the worst, but also very hard. One of the things we talked about earlier, that where we sit in the relationship with developers is there are a lot of behaviors that you see, and the real question is, why is someone doing that thing? Exercise is massive for this. If you go to a gym, you see 100 people, they're all working out. So behaviorally, they all look like they're doing the activity that you want, that they're all successfully exercising. But what's under the surface is very important to the prediction model for how long they're going to continue to exercise. So the question is what can we do with our framework to help find where each user is and help them along their journey to a healthier life? So the first thing you want to do is you want to measure and understand where the customer's at motivationally. And I'm going to kind of click through a number of statements which basically characterize different kinds of motivational quality. So someone might be exercising because they were told they need to make changes or they're going to die. This is close to our retirement thing again, where if you don't do this, horrible things will happen. The next one is, I know I should focus on my health. I'll feel guilty if I don't. I know it's the right thing to do. Not necessarily that I want to do it, but I should do it. The next statement is, I want to take care of myself because I know it will benefit my quality of life. And the last one is, I just enjoy having a healthy lifestyle. Basically, each of these are a different step along the way to higher motivational quality. And what we know by doing these studies 100 different times is that where you are in this journey is predictive of how long you're going to continue to exercise. Essentially, the first statements that I read have very bad results. That's where you hear people like, the stats like only 5% of people that start an exercise program continue with it for more than 8 weeks. On the far right, you see great outcomes. These are the people that run every day, have happy, healthy lives. And so the question is, what do you do about this problem? Because tons of the people that come into applications or come into gyms sit in the unhealthy space motivationally. And so as behavioral scientists that care about people's well-being, can we do anything? So first, we understand where they're at. The next thing we do is, if we know they're in a place motivationally that's not predictive of them continuing on with exercise, then we know that we have to help them internalize greater value for the activity. That means giving them the right content that supports their competence, communicates to them the long-term value, essentially tries to make an argument experientially about what the benefits of exercise are going to be, because we know we have to essentially move them within the application to a different place motivationally, or they're not going to stay around. I mentioned this early. I actually gave a push-up example, so it's perfect. Finally, you want to avoid signals that evoke evaluation or pressure. As some of you, looks like a pretty fit room in here, but some of you may have experienced not exercising for 2 or 3 years and trying to get back into it. What that feels like is you oftentimes feel like a novice coming back to an experience that you don't feel expert around. If you're in a gym, you're in an exercise app, oftentimes the assumption is you already know everything about exercise. You know the right form, you know how many to do, you know everything about it. Obviously that makes people feel like they lack competence. So then when they take their first baby steps into doing something and basically an application or a trainer says, wrong, 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 that's not how you do it, then obviously that's a barrier for people continuing on. So again, this is where you don't want the feedback to be judgmental, you want it to be informational. And oftentimes, judgmental feedback happens in very subtle ways. I kind of mentioned this earlier where we'll do things that have strong heuristic value, like flash a red light to say that your form's wrong. But essentially what someone's seeing that's in a fragile state around their competence is, I'm doing this wrong and I'm horrible at exercise, and what's the point? I should eat potato chips. Instead, what they need at that point is support. And so really what this approach is about is recognizing where people are motivationally and being sensitive to meet them at the place that they're at to try to move them to a healthier place around exercise. So the last thing I want to talk about is a workshop that my partner Scott did with Calm, which some of you may know is an excellent meditation app. And basically this is a lot of what our work looks like, where we sat down with them, understood their product, and kind of brainstormed some future possibilities for the application. The first thing that, there was a lot of ideas that came out of that. Someone at Scott's workshop said, my head's bursting, there's so many things that came up with this model in place. But some of the things that were most important was, one, let's try to replace a one-size-fits-all onboarding approach with content that matches the specific motivational profile of each customer. You can kind of see on the mock-up on the right, it's kind of some suggestions for a way a more tailored approach might be more appealing to people coming into an application. Instead of just saying, let's meditate, would you like to meditate to reduce anxiety, to improve your focus, to work on sleep issues, et cetera, et cetera? You can see how that would make someone feel more authorship, more ownership, feel more effective, be able to find the content they want. It's essentially the thing that we talked about earlier, which is this tailoring things to people's more specific growth interests. The next thing is we measure motivational quality when we work with developers. And so within the realm of meditation, it made perfect sense to say, the point we're trying to make is if you meditate, you see all these great outcomes to your physical health and psychological health. So why don't we take those measurements that we're doing for development purposes and show them to the consumers, show them that once they put in the work in their practice, that they're getting all these obvious benefits that they care about in their lives. That's a lot of the reason why people come to meditation apps. So that was an exciting idea that everyone kind of grabbed onto. And then lastly, that same detail that we use to show people that this is working also shows us where our program is not working as well as we would like it to. So it might be that we have these 8 different domains, and 3 of them, everyone that essentially tries to reduce anxiety gets perfect results, and we've crushed it. It might be that in 3 others, it works for some people and it doesn't work for other people's, and it might be in the last 2 that it's not working for anyone. This allows us, as developers, to pinpoint where we most need to add design features. And then we can start to triage, well, why aren't these 2 sections working well? Is it that people don't understand it? Are they ineffective? Do they not understand the value? Are they not seeing the benefits? Is there not good feedback? All the issues that we brought up before. And so essentially the point of these metrics is to give us more precision about why people are doing what they're doing in applications. So just a few takeaways that hopefully you got from today's talk. One is that you can build loyalty by authentically supporting your customers' basic psychological needs, which are autonomy, relatedness, and competence. I've been in literally, over the last 10, 15 years, 5,000 design discussions. And I understand how oftentimes you're triaging a problem, and a lot of times you do want to find any solution that'll work. Taking shortcuts is the wrong term, but you oftentimes get really myopic about how to solve a problem. Really what our recommendation is take a step back and try to understand the foundations of consumer behavior and motivation and say, how do we solve this design problem with that kind of greater perspective? Because that's essentially what's going to give you the best long-term results. Next thing is that reframing the app experience in the context of these needs deepens motivational quality and builds personal value that lasts. Really, it's a variation of the same point that I made before, that there's basically ways to design things that are much better suited to setting up long-term engagement. A lot of times we make choices as designers that might solve a problem temporarily, but this is really the foundation that lasts. The third thing is collecting motivational profiles, things like motivational quality and how the three basic psychological needs are being fulfilled, empowers customization of the user experience at scale. Oftentimes what you'll find is there are 3 or 4 or 5 profiles of consumers that you can find in your application, and you can make intelligent choices about which ones to serve first, how to serve each one of them. That ends up getting you really good benefits in consumer engagement very quickly. Fourth, remember the negative effects of external controls on autonomy, even when building reward systems. There's a lot of app design has ties back to game design. People realize very quickly that reward systems, badges, experience points, levels, all these things are an important part of game design. And there's a way in which those things can be employed effectively in applications to support people's narrative about the experience. But a lot of times when those things get divorced and it's all badges, rewards, levels, and no understanding of what's driving people's long-term engagement with the product, it essentially has an undermining effect on motivation and engagement. So you don't want to build your app's engagement on a foundation of sand. You really want to connect to the thing that's going to last. Lastly, as behavioral scientists that care about autonomy, we want to be autonomy supportive. We wouldn't want you to see this framework as rules. It's supposed to be guidelines to kind of inspire innovation, help you to think more creatively about how your application can improve its engagement. So that's hopefully the spirit that it's taken in. If you need any help figuring out what questions to ask, how to collect this kind of data, how to design more motivationally, please contact us at Immersyve. Thank you very much.